The Hargrove family had a way of making you feel small without ever raising their voices. Sophia Hargrove learned this early, sitting at the long mahogany dining table at age 7, watching her father pour wine for her 2 older brothers, while her plate was served last. Always last, as if the kitchen staff needed a reminder of the hierarchy. Her mother, Diane Hargrove, would smile at the boys with the warmth of a summer morning and glance at Sophia the way you glance at a misplaced vase, noticing it's there, wishing it weren't quite so visible. She was the 3rd child, the unplanned one, the girl. In a family that built its identity on Hargrove, men on real estate empires and political connections and golf courses named after grandfathers, a daughter was a footnote. Sophia grew up understanding this the way you understand weather. You didn't argue with it. You dressed accordingly. Still, she tried. She graduated high school with honors, while her brother Garrett barely scraped through with tutors her parents paid $500 an hour. She won the state debate championship at 16, while her brother Marcus was quietly bailed out of a DUI that never made the papers. She applied to Columbia Law on her own, drafted her personal statement at the kitchen table while her mother hosted a party in the next room, a party celebrating Marcus's acceptance into the same school 3 years prior, which had been announced with a catered dinner and a toast that shook the crystal. Sophia's acceptance letter arrived on a Tuesday morning. She left it on the kitchen counter, propped against the fruit bowl. Her mother moved it aside to make room for the grocery bags. That evening, Sophia mentioned it at dinner, quietly, the way she'd learned to say everything like a question, like an apology. "I got into Columbia Law," she said. Her father, Richard Hargrove, looked up from his steak. He had the face of a man who had never once doubted his own opinion. Silver-haired, broad-shouldered, the kind of handsome that had curdled into arrogance somewhere around his 45th birthday. "Columbia," he repeated, not warmly. "How do you plan to pay for that?" She blinked. "I thought the family fund—" "The family fund," Garrett said with a short laugh, not looking up from his phone, "is for people actually running the business. Your brothers are building Hargrove real estate," her father said, already cutting his next bite. "That takes capital, Sophia. Law school for someone who isn't going to use the degree to protect the family's assets, that's a personal expense." The silence that followed was the loudest thing she had ever heard. She paid for law school herself. Loans, scholarships, 3 part-time jobs, and 4 years of eating pasta 4 nights a week in a studio apartment with windows that didn't fully close in winter. She graduated in the top 8% of her class. She clerked for a federal judge. She took a position in civil litigation. She was good quietly, devastatingly good at understanding systems, at reading rooms, at finding the single loose thread in a carefully constructed lie. She never told her family any of it. They stopped calling after her 31st birthday. When she declined to attend the Hargrove Family Foundation Gala, a black tie event her family held annually to photograph themselves next to their charitable contributions. She hadn't been given a seat at the main table anyway. She'd been placed near the exit, beside a distant cousin nobody remembered inviting. She declined. She sent a card. She didn't hear from them for 2 years. Then, on a cold February morning 11 years after that kitchen table dinner, Sophia Hargrove opened a case file that had just been assigned to her courtroom. She read the name at the top. Hargrove Real Estate Holdings, LLC voluntary bankruptcy petition. She sat very still for a long time. Then she set the file down, folded her hands, and felt something she hadn't felt in years, the quiet arrival of patience paying off. What the file didn't show her, what no file ever could, was everything that happened in the years between. Sophia had tried, twice, to rebuild something with her family. The first attempt came at her mother's 65th birthday, which Sophia had attended armed with a bottle of good wine and a genuine desire to let old wounds calcify into indifference. She'd sat at the table and watched her mother open gifts jewelry from Garrett, a weekend trip from Marcus, and from Sophia, a first-edition copy of a novel her mother had mentioned loving once, years ago, a detail Sophia had remembered and quietly carried for a decade. Her mother unwrapped it, glanced at it, said, "Oh, how thoughtful," in the tone reserved for candles you'd never burn. Garrett leaned across the table and said to no one in particular, "Mom always said Sophia was the sentimental one. Like a greeting card, with a law degree. The table laughed. Her mother smiled. Her father was already refilling his glass. Sophia drove home in silence and sat in her car in the parking garage for 22 minutes. She didn't cry. She had learned, a long time ago, that crying required an audience that believed your pain was real. The second attempt came 2 years later, when Sophia called her father to share news that mattered to her. She'd been appointed to a federal judgeship, the youngest in the district. It had been covered in the state bar journal. She wasn't expecting a party. She just wanted him to know. He let her finish. There was a pause on the line. "Federal judge," he said. "Good for you." Another pause. "Listen, while I have you, we're restructuring the company, and Marcus thought it might be useful to have someone on the inside of the federal court system. Nothing improper, just you understand how these things work. Family taking care of family." She hung up. That call hollowed her in a way the birthday dinner hadn't. Because she had known, somewhere beneath all her careful professionalism and self-constructed dignity, that she'd been hoping for something. Some small acknowledgement. Some version of her father saying, "We were wrong about you." Instead, she was still useful to them only as a tool. She stopped hoping after that. Hope, she decided, was just grief wearing a costume. What she couldn't know yet, was that Hargrove real estate had been quietly collapsing for 3 years. Marcus had overleveraged 6 commercial properties on speculative projections. Garrett had approved a series of contractor deals with a cousin of his girlfriend's. Deals that were padded, fraudulent, and now the subject of a federal investigation. Richard Hargrove, who had always moved through the world as though consequences were something that happened to other families, had signed off on all of it. The empire her brothers had been groomed to inherit was built on sand. And then the bankruptcy petition arrived in Sophia's courtroom. She read through the initial filing with a prosecutor's eye. The debts were staggering: $11 million in unsecured loans, $14 million in disputed contractor claims, a web of shell entities that would take months to untangle. She recognized the law firm representing them. Expensive, confident, the kind of lawyers who wore their fees like cologne. She also recognized something else. The lead attorney had listed, in the petition, a request for expedited consideration and leniency, citing the Hargrove family's decades of community philanthropy and civic contribution. Sophia read that line 3 times. Then she set the file in the center of her desk, precisely, the way you set something down that you intend to pick up again very carefully. She went home that night and made tea. She sat at her kitchen table, a small one, nothing like the mahogany monolith of her childhood, and she thought about every meal she had eaten standing up, every achievement that had been received in silence, every phone call that was really a transaction. She didn't feel rage. She felt clarity. A lesser person would have recused herself. Sophia understood that. She turned the question over for 72 hours, 3 days of walking to work in the cold, of sitting in her chambers with the file closed in front of her, of making coffee she didn't drink. She was a federal judge. Her entire identity was built on the sanctity of impartiality. She had clerked under Judge William Farris, who used to say that the courtroom was the only room in America where the law was more powerful than money. She had believed him. She still did. And yet, she was not required to recuse herself from a case simply because she knew the parties. Judges presided over cases involving their communities, their industries, their cities. The requirement was that she preside without bias, that she let the law speak. Let the law speak. She turned that phrase over like a coin. The law, if applied correctly and completely, would do everything she needed it to do. She didn't need to tilt anything. She didn't need to bend a single rule. She only needed to be what she had always been: precise, thorough, and absolutely unmerciful in her commitment to procedure. She spent 3 weeks doing what she always did before a complex hearing. She read everything. Every filing, every exhibit, every footnote. She pulled the corporate history of Hargrove Real Estate going back 18 years. She cross-referenced the contractor claims against public records. She identified 3 discrepancies in the initial petition that the opposing creditors hadn't caught yet. She noted that the family had listed, as personal assets exempt from the bankruptcy estate, 2 properties that were legally still held in the company's name, a filing error, or an intentional misdirection. She wrote a memo to her clerk, flagged the discrepancies, requested supplemental documentation from the petitioner's counsel. The attorney, a man named Bradford Cole, who had the particular smugness of someone who had never lost in a courtroom he'd chosen, sent back a letter suggesting the judge might be misreading the filing. Politely, condescendingly. Sophia read it once, set it down, and drafted a court order requiring full financial disclosure within 10 business days. At home, in the evenings, she sat with the moral weight of what she was doing, not doing. She corrected herself. She wasn't doing anything except her job, but intention was a strange, quiet thing. She knew why she was so thorough. She knew whose face she saw when she read about those $11 million in debt. She knew that some part of her wanted this, wanted to sit at the head of a room and watch them finally understand what it cost to waste someone. She wrestled with that. Some nights she nearly drafted a recusal motion. Then she'd think about the contractor workers, 14 separate small businesses, mostly family-owned, who were listed as creditors. People who had done real work and been paid in bad checks. People who didn't have law firms that cost $700 an hour. Those people deserved an exacting, thorough judge. She decided she was still that judge. She prepared for the hearing with the focus of someone who had been preparing their whole life without knowing it. The morning of the hearing, Sophia dressed the way she always dressed. Dark blazer, minimal jewelry, her hair pulled back with the kind of clean severity that courtrooms required. She made coffee. She read the news. She took the same route she always took. She did not feel nervous. The courtroom was full by the time she took the bench. Bradford Cole sat at the petitioner's table, flanked by 2 associates. Across the aisle, a cluster of creditors' attorneys arranged their folders with the urgent energy of people who had been waiting a long time to be heard. And in the gallery she saw them before they saw her. Richard Hargrove, thinner than she remembered, his silver hair still impeccable, his posture still the posture of a man who believed rooms arranged themselves around him. Garrett, scrolling his phone until the bailiff told him to put it away. Marcus, who looked like he hadn't slept in weeks, whose eyes swept the courtroom with the anxious darting of someone reading the exits. Her mother was not there. Sophia took her seat. The room rose. She told them to be seated. Bradford Cole looked up. She watched the exact moment he read her nameplate. The Honorable Sophia A. Hargrove, U.S. District Judge. Something moved across his face. Calculation. Then a careful rearrangement into professional neutrality. He leaned toward his client, toward Richard, and Sophia watched her father look up, look toward the bench, and go very still. She did not acknowledge him. She opened the file. "This is the matter of Hargrove Real Estate Holdings, LLC," she said, her voice even and clear. "Before we proceed, I want to address the supplemental documentation requests issued on the 14th. Mr. Cole, your office submitted revised financials that I've reviewed, and I have several questions about the property classifications in Schedule A." Cole stood smoothly. "Your Honor, we believe the filings accurately reflect—" "I didn't ask for your belief, Mr. Cole. I asked for documentation." She looked at him over the rim of her glasses. "Specifically, I want to understand how 2 properties registered under the corporate entity as of 18 months ago are now being claimed as personal exempt assets in this petition. The timeline suggests a transfer. I want the transfer documents." The silence in the room had texture. Cole said they would need additional time to produce those documents. Sophia said she was sure they would. She granted a 2-week continuance and issued a formal order for full asset disclosure, including all transfers within the past 24 months. She also, quietly, referred the discrepancy to the U.S. Trustee's office, not because she had to, not because it was extraordinary, but because it was exactly what the law required. As the hearing was adjourned and she rose, she finally allowed herself one glance at her father. Richard Hargrove was staring at her, not with anger, not with recognition of what was happening, with something far more satisfying: confusion, the bewildered, hollow look of a man encountering a force he had never thought to account for. She gathered her files and walked out. In her chambers, she sat for a moment in the silence. Her hands were steady. Her heart was steady. The trustees' review took 6 weeks. What it found rearranged everything. The 2 misclassified properties were the beginning, Beneath them was a pattern, a deliberate, years-long pattern of asset shuffling designed to protect the family's personal wealth while the company's creditors, including 14 small businesses, went unpaid. The scheme had been orchestrated primarily by Marcus, with Richard's signature on the key documents. Garrett, it turned out, had known and said nothing. Federal fraud charges followed. Not from Sophia's courtroom, those were referred to a separate prosecutor, but her documentation had been the thread. Her thorough, procedurally impeccable work had been the thread. She recused herself from all subsequent proceedings, as she was legally required to do once the matter crossed into criminal territory involving parties known to her. She filed the recusal paperwork personally, carefully, without drama. She told no one why she'd been so thorough. No one asked. The case moved forward without her. The outcome, guilty pleas from both Richard and Marcus, a settlement that dissolved Hargrove real estate entirely and distributed recovered assets to creditors, was reported in the regional business press. A small item, the kind of story that runs on page 8 and is forgotten by the following Tuesday. Sophia read it over breakfast. She finished her coffee. She rinsed the cup. And then she received a letter. Handwritten. Postmarked from a Phoenix address she didn't recognize. She opened it. Sophia, I want you to know that I knew. Not about the fraud, I didn't know the specifics until the end. But I knew what your father and brothers did to you. I knew it was wrong and I said nothing for 30 years. I told myself it wasn't my place. I told myself you were strong and didn't need me to intervene. I told myself a great many things. I am not asking for forgiveness. I'm not sure I deserve to ask. I only want you to know that I am sorry. I am proud of you. I think I always was, and was too afraid of your father to say so. Mom. Sophia sat with the letter for a long time. She had imagined this moment before, some version of it anyway. Vindication, acknowledgement. She had expected it would feel like victory. It felt like standing in a room where a fire had burned out. Warm, still, but emptied. She thought about her mother's hands, how they'd moved through her childhood like background figures in someone else's film. She thought about the fruit bowl, the wine poured for the boys, the birthday gift received with polite indifference. She thought about whether she would write back. She thought about the 14 small business owners who had gotten partial repayment of what they were owed. She thought about the junior attorney in her court who'd told her last week that she was the fairest judge he'd ever practiced in front of. She thought about the girl who'd left her acceptance letter propped against a fruit bowl and waited for someone to notice. She folded the letter, set it on the table, beside her empty coffee cup. Then she stood, gathered her coat, and walked out into the morning to do the work she had built herself from nothing to do. She didn't write back. Not because she didn't forgive her mother, she wasn't sure yet, and she was a woman who had learned not to lie about what she was sure of. She didn't write back because the letter, she realized, wasn't the ending she'd been moving toward. It was just more evidence. Evidence that the family had never known her, that they had built a mythology of her absence and called it her failure, that even now, in the wreckage they had made of themselves, her mother's letter was written to the girl from the kitchen table, not the woman on the bench. They had spent 30 years calling her the family mistake. They had never once considered that a mistake, properly examined, is how the truth gets found. Justice, she had learned, does not announce itself. It waits. It studies. It prepares. And when the room finally falls silent, it speaks not in fury, but in the clean, irrevocable language of everything you refuse to see coming.